When your readers sit down to read your story, they have an object in their hands. With the exception of the printed medium, hardcover, paperback, ebook, etc., the text of the story is exactly the same. As I've mentioned more than a few times, a text is an object, and books are mass-produced to be identical objects. But the story will never be the same for two different readers. This lesson is about how it gets different. This lesson is about the things the reader does for you, how they take your words and process them into their cognitive simulation. This is about how they make the story come alive. Part of our drawn-out story definition goes like this: language-based instructions arranged in an order that cues the reader to simulate an approximate cognitive model of a specific modal universe. Reading fiction, when you boil it down to its essence, is the effort the reader's mind makes to process those words into a cognitive simulation approximating the experience intended by the author when they offered the words, sentences, and events the specific way they did. We don't need to think too much about the words on the page just yet. That's the next episode. For now, we're going to focus on the images those words produce, the sequence of scenes that add up to the reader experiencing your story world. The reader's part in our little telepathic dance is a big one, obviously. But it's a very difficult issue to grapple with for writers, narrative theorists, and cognitive scientists alike. This is because while the writer creates something concrete and measurable, a reproducible text, the reader provides inferences and memories, and those are two very fuzzy things. Let's look at a passage that explores what I mean. A black-caped figure prowled among the houses. An owl screeched. 3 children were borne away into the night. Take a moment to think about those 3 sentences. I'm going to read them again. A black-caped figure prowled among the houses. An owl screeched. 3 children were borne away into the night. Now think about what your mind does with these 3 sentences. Narrative theorist David Herman offers this micronarrative as a case study in the reader's cooperative effort. He points out that a reader generally draws inferences about the causality of events. In this case, did you connect the caped figure to the 3 children being carried away into the night? Did you notice that nothing in the text explicitly indicates that the black-caped figure had anything to do with the children's disappearance? If this were a trial, Capey would get off. All the evidence is circumstantial. Just because an owl screeched and the kids were borne away doesn't prove our caped friend had anything to do with it. Maybe it was Batman out looking for kidnappers and the owl was like, "What's up, Batman? What are you doing in these parts?" Yet, the reader's mind is going to infer causality and connect these events as you probably did. Inferences like these are a huge part of what the reader brings to the table. What about the houses? Did you visualize some of those? What type of houses were they? And the owl? What about Owlie? Was he perched on a tree branch in your simulation as Batman was running by? If you think yes, Ro, there was a tree. That's interesting because there's no mention of trees whatsoever in the text. But I'm guessing there's at least a hint of one in your simulation. Readers construct cognitive imagery around the skeletal structure of the written. We visualize things that aren't in the text explicitly. How do we do this? Technically, cognitively. Picture a hospital room. Take a few moments. Think about it. Pause and visualize a hospital room. Form a mental image. What does this room look like? What's in it? It probably looks a lot like a hospital room. A bed or two, those sliding curtains, a window on the wall opposite the doorway. And there should be a sink where the caregivers can wash their hands. Also, there's a TV hanging at the foot of each bed, a couple chairs, and a pair of rolling tray tables, as well as a bunch of doohickeys and cables connected to the wall and IV poles that are dangling near the head of the beds. Wow, that's a lot, right? All that's in the memory bucket for hospital room, stored away in Ro's brain. And there's probably a lot more too if I were willing to try your patience any further with this example. This type of memory is called schematic memory, and the items I just described are schema or schemata, depending on whether you're dealing with the singular or plural. Cognitive scientists usually define schema as something like knowledge describing what is typical or frequent in a particular situation. Like with memory of many complex events, your brain relies on schematic information to fill gaps in memory about space and place. Our brains, by necessity, are very good at compressing repeated information. It's why you don't stress about the color of the walls in your house unless you're painting them. They just fall into the background and you give them no thought. You don't need to think about what color they are all the time. Similarly, if you walked into a hospital room, you wouldn't give the normal features of the room much thought at all. You've got more important things on your mind, like whether the patient you've come to visit is going to be all right. You don't have to spend any time figuring out things that are crucial to your understanding of the situation. These can be as basic as, what is the purpose of a hospital, and why is my family member there? Once you've acquired a sufficient base of schematic knowledge about hospitals, you never have to ask those questions again. If you brought a child with you into that hospital room, though, a child who's never been to a hospital, then you're likely to get a whole lot of questions. What are those things on the wall? Why are those tubes attached to grandma? What do those buttons on the bed do? This is a person mapping space, building schematic memory that they can recall later. It pays for people to understand their environment, and picking out the similarities and, more importantly, the prominent differences between environments is crucial to a person's ability to understand their environment and social contexts as well. Thus, as writers, we need to assume a baseline amount of schematic knowledge about the situations we're writing about, because our readers are going to fill in a lot of major gaps that don't need to be explicitly presented in the text. For instance, if your character goes to visit someone in the hospital, you probably don't need to do too much to call up an accurate representative image of the room. They'll also understand implicitly that the other character is very sick, that they're probably lying in bed wearing a gown and are attached to an IV drip by a clear plastic tube. So let's check out a writer using generalized schematic information to help construct a setting. This is an excerpt from the short story Bible by Tobias Wolff. And at this point in the story, the female protagonist, a teacher, is being forced into her car by an unknown assailant in an empty parking lot. The keys, give them to me. Maureen held the keys out behind her, eyes pressed shut. She had just one thought, do not see him. The keys were taken from her hand. She heard the door being unlocked. Open it, the man said. Open the door. Yes, now, get in. Just take it, Maureen said, please. Please, will you get in? Please. He took her arm and half pushed, half lifted her into the car and slammed the door shut. She sat behind the steering wheel with her head bent, eyes closed, hands folded over her purse. The passenger door opened. Compositions? The man muttered. Exams, she said, and cringed at her stupidity in correcting him. Maureen heard the blue books thud onto the floor in the back. Then he was on the seat beside her. He sat there a moment, breathing quick, shallow breaths. Open your eyes. Open. Yes, now drive. He jingled the keys, looking straight ahead over the wheel. She said, I don't think I can. There isn't a lot of specific information about this teacher's car. A bit earlier in the story, there's a mention of a new paint job fading, but it's hard to make the case that the car is described in detail. There are a few places where the setting elements are referenced explicitly, and essentially the narrator mentions 2 doors, the keys, the steering wheel, the 2 seats, and the floor in the back. Presumably, though, there's a dashboard, a radio, a glove compartment, a rearview mirror, all the vital stuff. And depending on the reader, some of that is going to appear in their simulation of the scene. But Wolff's narrator leaves it to the imagination. There are a couple good reasons for this. First, this is a place all readers are going to have a strong schematic memory for. People spend a lot of time in cars. We all know what's in that space. Eco-critics, literary scholars who study portrayals of the environment in literature, they call settings like these non-spaces. Generally, the term non-space is reserved for very generic human-created spaces that seem the same everywhere, like the inside of a McDonald's or Starbucks, or a bus station or an airport terminal. And the interior of a car, given that cars are mass-produced, works here as well. The next good reason to leave a lot to the reader's imagination is the plot. What does it matter whether the teacher is driving a Subaru or a Ford? She's getting kidnapped. This is a highly suspenseful situation, and the narrator rightly keeps the focus on the abductor and his victim. That's where the primary drama in the story comes from. Great authors like Tobias Wolff know when the scenery matters and when it doesn't. And when the protagonist is getting forced into her car by a stranger, the reader can decide whether her car is a teal sedan or a purple minivan, doesn't really matter to the story. Lastly, you already know what kind of car she drives, don't you? She's a teacher with exam books in her front seat. It's not a Lamborghini or a Tesla. It's probably not even a mid-tier sedan. She's driving some sort of compact economy car or a crappy 10-year-old sedan or minivan. So why mention the doors, the steering wheel, and the seats at all then, if the reader can fill in the blanks? Easy. All the references to the car orient the characters in the space, outlining the drama. For instance, him pushing her into the car lets the reader know he's in control of the situation, and places her in a specific space the reader can visualize from, the driver's seat. This is bare bones description of setting, only enough to complement the plot and give the reader enough of a frame to make the scene come to life with their input. You'll see a lot of very successful writing take advantage of vague, generic settings like a car, a living room, or an office. That's where people live, after all. More specialized schematic knowledge can be a bit trickier for the writer. Here's an example of what I mean from Maggie Shipstead's The Cowboy Tango. At this part in the story, the ranch owner is giving young Sammy a test to see if she can handle herself around horses. He dropped a saddle and a bridle in her arms and showed her a short-legged twist of a buckskin, a bitch mare who had nearly thrown Mr. Otterbosch. When Sammy pulled the cinch tight, the mare flattened her ears and lunged around, her square teeth biting the air until they met Sammy's hard-swung fist. The mare squealed and pointed her nose at the sky, but then she stood still. Sammy climbed up. The mare dropped her head and crow-hopped off to the right. Sammy jerked the reins up, but not meanly, and kicked the mare through the gate into the home paddock. In 5 minutes, she had her going around like a show pony. There are some places in this passage where the schematic knowledge is a bit more specialized than generic car. Things like a saddle and a bridle, short-legged twist of a buckskin, pulled the cinch tight, crow-hopped off to the right, home paddock. In this case, the setting is a horse ranch, and the schematic knowledge the reader will be calling up from memory is their horse ranch bucket of memories. Imagine you're a reader from Queens or Inglewood. Perhaps you've never seen a horse ranch, much less ridden a horse. Your horse ranch memory bucket is going to be a lot less full than a reader from Montana. You might not know exactly what a cinch, a bridle, or a home paddock is. But Shipstead's narrator doesn't pause here to explain. Even if all you know about riding horses is that you need a saddle, that's enough schematic knowledge to build around. Your readers, just like you, are going to be pretty good at picking up meaning from the context. What's a crow hop? I suppose it's just good enough to visualize a horse jumping like a crow. And that's not the way a well-trained horse moves. Seems like Sammy's got her work cut out for her. A home paddock? Well, she's riding the horse there, and there's a gate, so it's probably something like a pen near the barn, right? Good enough. And that's one of the keys to understanding how to manage schematic knowledge in your stories. The human mind is a product of cognitive trade-offs, and the most common trade-off is a version of the old maxim, done is better than perfect. The mind is prone to making many small mistakes in processing, but it usually gets things mostly right, most of the time, which allows us to keep on living. As writers, a few cues that help the reader access schematic knowledge and understand context will set the reader off in the right direction, allowing them to follow and fill in the blanks as they go along. The other useful attribute of specialized schematic knowledge is that it lends a sense of authenticity to the story. A reader learning what a home paddock is for the first time is a reader experiencing a cowboy story, going new places and seeing new things. And again, note how the action takes precedence over the setting. This is a great example of specialized schematic knowledge done well, neither over or under-explained, just presented as a complement to the plot. What about when the schemata become part of the plot? Okay, that may not make much sense worded as such, but that's what's up next on our to-do list. You have a ton of schematic knowledge for places, but you also have schematic knowledge for events. Narrative theorists call these scripts. And you have a ton of them in your head. You sit down at a restaurant and what happens? Someone hands you and your fellow diners a menu, fills your water glasses and says, "Hi, welcome to Red Lobster. My name is Terry and I'll be taking care of you today." Right? It's almost exactly like that every time. You can bank on these everyday occurrences going a certain way. So much so that when a waiter, a teller at a bank, a bus driver, or a flight attendant deviates from their script, it's immediately notable or noteworthy. Scripts were first described for narrative theorists by the computer programmer Roger Schank, who defined them this way. A script is a structure that describes an appropriate sequence of events in a particular context. A script is made up of slots and requirements about what can fill these slots. Schank was experimenting with AI that could generate stories, and one of the byproducts of trying to figure out how to program an AI to tell stories was discovering the vast number of inferences a reader makes in order to understand the context of a story. Scripts were a big part of this. A computer wouldn't immediately understand why a waiter kept returning to the table to fill the water glasses, or even that humans drink water. The AI needs to be told everything. But people rely on schema and scripts to compare what's happening now with what they expect to happen based on past experiences and context. So when your character gets on the bus, she's going to stop at the front, pay her fare, maybe say hello to the bus driver if she's friendly, and then take her seat. Your readers are going to understand that process based on their script for getting on bus. Scripts have two great advantages that writers can exploit. The first is that a script can allow your story to be compressed the same way a certain amount of schematic knowledge can be left to the reader. If your character is renting a car, unless something relevant to the plot or characterization is happening, the writer doesn't need to present the script in its entirety, or perhaps even at all. This can help to streamline the story and keep it only to the interesting bits. The other advantage of a script is that when your characters deviate from the script, it's going to catch your reader's attention just as it would in real life. Here's an example of perhaps the most shocking and riveting deviation from a script I've ever read, from Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men. This is the start of the infamous gas station scene where serial killer Anton Chigurh goes inside to pay for his gas, a transaction we all know well. Then this happens. "Y'all getting any rain up your way?" the proprietor said. "Which way would that be?" "I seen you was from Dallas." Chigurh picked his change up off the counter. "And what business of yours is it where I'm from, friendo?" "I didn't mean nothing by it." "You didn't mean nothing by it." "I was just passing the time of day." "I guess that passes for manners in your cracker view of things." "Well, sir, I apologize, and if you don't want to accept my apology, I don't know what else I can do for you." A normal person's script, of course, requires that Chigurh says something like, "Nope, been a dry summer up my way." But he's not playing, because Chigurh is not a normal person, and that's what sets this scene off on a terrifying tangent. It outlines the hair-trigger personality that could get a person killed in an instant, whenever they have the misfortune to come in contact with Chigurh. But it also outlines the role chance plays in the killer's worldview. The way he deviates from expectations catches the reader's interest, and knowing that he's a psychopath helps to keep the reader in even greater suspense. As the scene unfolds, the cashier becomes increasingly aware of what the reader already knows, that Chigurh might very well end his life over a harmless attempt at small talk with the wrong guy. Scripts are useful to compress needless procedures and processes, but they're great when your character breaks from script to a purpose. Script should not be confused with a similar idea in storytelling called scenes à faire, which in French means something approximating scenes that must be done. These are scenes that are so common to a genre that they're almost obligatory. Think the diagnosis scene in a medical drama or a gunfight in a western. Scenes à faire differ from scripts in that there are many different ways that they could go down, whereas a script has a much more prescribed set of actions that are expected to be followed. With a scene à faire, it would be hard to imagine a global plot of its kind without that type of scene, like an I love you scene in a romance, an interrogation in a murder mystery, or a final fight against the villain in a superhero film. Scripts refer much more to a specific element of a local plot, like getting on a bus, checking out a library book, or boarding a plane. And a final and critical concept to understanding how your readers will constitute the textual simulation from the words on the page is brought to us by who else? Mary Lou Ryan. She calls this the principle of minimal departure, and it works like this. The colonists on Omega Prime were an extraordinarily happy lot, living a nearly utopian existence hidden away in the Vernian Nebula, far from the reach of the Imperial Federation. Their dome-like glass cities resembled massive crystal cathedrals rising toward the night sky, like glittering monuments to creative ingenuity. They were a civilization of artists and scientists who spent most of their days in the peaceful pursuit of knowledge and artisanship. They loved music and games and had brought their ingenious technology for industrial food production, so as not to threaten this foreign planet's magnificent biodiversity with any invasive species. If it weren't for their hideous bug-like appearance and rancid natural odor, Jake and Judy would have thought they'd crash-landed in some civilization of angels. But the colonists of Omega Prime were not angels. They called themselves Glorkunks, and they were the ugliest aliens Jake and Judy had ever seen. Show of hands. Who thought the Glorkunks were people? It's okay, feel free to put the hand up. The thing is, the principle of minimal departure ordains that you probably thought Glorkunks were people. Why? Because the text gave you no indication they weren't, until it did. How could a reader be expected to imagine smelly, bug-like creatures randomly? Minimal departure is a bit like a generic construct that your mind inserts into the text and then hangs onto until the narrator indicates the specific details of the construct that should be altered to fit the story. So, until Ishmael informs the reader that one of Captain Ahab's legs has been eaten by a whale and that he hobbles around on a peg leg, the reader will assume that Ahab has 2 legs, because the general cognitive blueprint for a person has 2 legs. This works for spaces as well. If a story is set in a city, your reader is going to load their generic schematic memories for city, unless and until your narrator informs them how they must deviate from this schematic knowledge to create the correct specific images to distinguish your story world from the real world. The city in your story is going to look an awful lot like the reader's idea of a city, until you tell them that it's a dome-like glass city resembling a massive crystal cathedral like on Omega Prime. So if your story is set on Earth in the present day, you won't have to do a lot of work to get your reader on the same page as far as story world schemata and scripts. If you're writing a sci-fi set in a distant galaxy or a dragon adventure in a fantasy world, the details must extend out from a general conceptualization of human life in that place and era. It's important to remember that your text, the words on the page, doesn't start from scratch at word 1. The building of a story world is a cooperative effort between your words and the reader's memory to direct them in creating characters and places that pull them away from their general understanding of the real world. Their role in the drama isn't to be underestimated, but it is to be understood. Schema, scripts, and minimal departure will bring you much closer to a greater understanding, I hope. As writers, we don't need to start from scratch. Rather, creating a compelling story world is about selecting the right details that guide the reader in drawing on the correct schema and scripts, and also deviating from those schema and scripts in interesting ways to prompt the creation of a unique story world in your reader's mind. In the coming lessons, we'll look specifically at how readers construct mental spaces and images in order to help you to guide their construction of your story world.